Hello and welcome to Vivork. I'm Brian Watrous. In this video, we will be exploring how to modify input parameters in vRealize Orchestrator. The short version of this is you can't do that. vRealize Orchestrator, for reasons we're going to talk about, vRealize Orchestrator does not allow you to modify input parameters. So either this is going to be the shortest video I've ever created, or we've got some investigating to do. So let's continue onwards. Now, in this particular video, I'm going to take us through a quick review of input parameters, output parameters, and attributes, along with inward binding and outward binding. Then, after that, we'll take a look at why it's not possible to modify input parameters. But we won't leave it there. There are some techniques that you can use to enable you to do what you're trying to do. Strictly speaking, you're not modifying input parameters, but it's going to be as if you are. So let's move onwards and see what we've got here. Now again, quick reminder here, in vRealize Orchestrator, you need to perform something known as parameter binding, or sometimes called variable binding. That involves explicitly setting up bindings to input parameters, output parameters, and or attributes. Those bindings can either be inward bindings or outward bindings. With an inward binding, that's going to enable us to read the value that's stored in a variable, which means we'll be able to execute code like this. So for instance, system.log myvar, in order for us to be able to execute that code, Orchestrator needs to be able to read what's inside the variable called myvar. And in order to be able to do that, we're going to need an inward binding. With outward bindings, those enable us to change the value that's stored by a variable. In other words, we're going to write out a new value to the variable itself. That enables us to execute code such as the code you see here. So whenever you say variable name equals something, whatever the expression may be on the right side of the equal sign, if you say variable name equals something, you're attempting to assign a new value to that variable. And in order for that assignment to stick and to persist, we need to make certain that we have an outward binding. So again, there are inward binding and outward binding. So if you followed that, give you an opportunity here for a quick little pop quiz to test your own understanding. Take a look at the code on the screen here and ask yourself, what kind of binding would you need? Go ahead and pause the video if you'd like to think about this code here, and when you're done, resume the video. Well, admittedly, that was a little bit of a tricky question because the answer is you actually need two bindings in this case. You need an inward binding to the variable called myvar, because in order to be able to add 1 to the existing value in myvar, we need to know what's in myvar. What is the value that's stored in myvar? That would require an inward binding. But that's not the only thing we're doing with myvar in this example. As you can see over on the other side of this expression, we're also attempting to assign the value, a new value to myvar. And that, as we saw in the previous slide, would require that we have an outward binding. So for this particular code to work, we would need to have both an inward binding and an outward binding. Okay, now that we remember the difference between an inward binding and an outward binding, let's take a look at what's actually going on when you do these parameter bindings. So as you can see in this screenshot here, we have a very simple workflow. It has 5 different schema elements, a start and an end, and then in between we have the 3 schema elements that we're more likely to be interested in. I've called them E1, E2, and E3. Now those 3 schema elements could be scriptable tasks or other types of schema elements, but for our purposes, let's just assume that E1, E2, and E3 are scriptable tasks. Now what happens when you do variable binding is you create a connection between variables in your workflow with variables inside of these schema elements. Now we'll refer to the variables inside your schema elements, we'll refer to those as local variables. So in our workflow, we may have input parameters, output parameters, and attributes, but none of those input parameters, output parameters, and attributes are visible inside of the schema elements until we set up our parameter binding. So imagine, if you will, in our workflow, we have a pair of input parameters called in1 and in2. Now, when we first start out and create those input parameters are completely invisible to all the schema elements. No schema elements can see what's in those two input parameters. No schema element could change what's in those parameters. None of the schema elements know about those two input parameters. So by setting up parameter binding, what we're doing is explicitly creating a connection between an existing variable, such as an input parameter, output parameter, or attribute. In this example here, let's assume we're trying to set up an explicit connection between the input parameter called in1 and the schema element called e1. Now in this particular case, I know those both have the number 1 in them, in1 and e1 both have the number 1, but there's nothing that says that the input parameter in1 has to be bound to e1. In fact, in1 could be bound to any or all of these schema elements. But for our purposes here, we're illustrating with this red arrow an inward binding from the input parameter called in1 to the schema element called e1. Now, to be even more specific, the binding isn't between the input parameter and the schema element. Conceptually, you can think of it that way, but the reality is it's a binding between that input parameter and a local variable inside of E1. Now, in many cases, the name of your input parameter and the name of the local variable inside of E1 could have the exact same name, but there's nothing that says that the names have to match. By default, they tend to match, but they don't have to match in names. So as we continue onwards here, let's advance a little bit here and notice that just to illustrate the point, here I'm illustrating a binding, specifically an inward binding from the input parameter called in2 to some variable inside of schema element e3. Again, there's no need for the numbers of the variables and the numbers of these schema elements to match at all. So now we can see that if we set up inward bindings from our input parameters into these different schema elements, specifically into some variable in the schema elements, then we'll be able to access the value of our input parameters from within those schema elements, provided we use the local variables that we set up in the binding. Now, in addition to input parameters, your workflow is quite likely going to have one or more output parameters. And in order for us to change the value of that output parameter, once again, we'd need some binding because E1, E2, E3, none of those schema elements knows anything about the output parameter called out1. We would have to set up an outward binding. Now, in the case of input parameters and output parameters, you can only do one type of binding for each of those. With input parameters, you can only do inward bindings. And with output parameters, as the name suggests, you can only do outward binding. And while we're talking nitpicky here, another thing to know about input parameters and output parameters is input parameters are read-only variables and output parameters are write-only variables. On the other hand, we have another type of workflow variable called attributes. For instance, in this example here, let's imagine we had an attribute called attr1. Now, unlike input parameters and output parameters that are limited in terms of the type of bindings that you can do, with attributes, we could create a binding from our attribute to a local variable in a schema element, such as we've illustrated here with this latest red arrow. In this case here, this is an inward binding, but with attributes, you can also create outward bindings. So unlike input parameters and output parameters, which can only have either inward binding or outward binding, with attributes, you can do binding in either direction. And furthermore, unlike input parameters and output parameters, which are read-only and write-only respectively, attributes are read-write variables. And that read-write capability is going to be super important to what we're striving to do here shortly. Let's take a look at why you cannot modify input parameters. So taking a look at our simple example here, we have a workflow. It has 3 schema elements, a start and end, and a schema element called E1. Let's assume that that schema element is a scriptable task. Now, as you can see in this workflow, we have one variable in the workflow. It's an input parameter called myvar. Now, what you're going to be tempted to do at times with your input parameters is do things like increment the value of the input parameter. For instance, if the myvar input parameter was a number and we wanted to add 1 to that number, the first thing we're going to need to be able to do is see what the current value is that's stored in myvar. So as you already know, that would require that we have an inward binding. And as we know from before, the name of the variable inside of E1, the local variable inside of E1, could have the same name or could have a separate name. For our purposes, let's assume that the input parameter name is myvar, and the local variable inside of E1 to which it's inwardly bound, let's assume it's also called myvar. So far things are looking good. We've got our inward binding. We'll be able to see what's in myvar and add 1 to it. But what if we did attach some code to our E1 scriptable task? What if we said myvar equals myvar plus 1? Now, the first thing to be real clear on right now is any code that you write, such as the code I'm illustrating here, myvar equal myvar plus 1, any code that you write that way, all of the variables that you see in that code are local variables. They're variables within the schema element. They may have the same name as an external variable, such as our input parameter called myvar, but the code inside of your scriptable task contains local variables. And if we just make changes to those local variables without any bindings, we're not working with the workflow variables. We're working with the local variables in the schema element. But when you do the trickery that we've illustrated with the red line, when you create a binding from that input parameter called myvar to the local variable in E1 called myvar, then we can potentially run code such as what you see illustrated on the screen here. And this code will work in part. For instance, everything on the right side of the equal sign will work. Notice we're trying to say myvar plus 1. In order to do that expression, myvar plus 1, we need to know what's in the variable called myvar. Well, that local variable called myvar is inwardly bound to the input parameter called myvar, so the code on the right side of this expression will work. We can successfully say myvar plus 1 and calculate the result of that expression. But the left side of our expression, so the stuff on the left of the equal sign, is not going to work. When you say variable named equals, that's an assignment. In this case here, we're saying local variable called myvar equals, and then we're going to set it to some value. Now, the value we're going to be able to calculate successfully, but we're not going to be able to perform the assignment because that local variable called myvar does not have an outward binding to anything at all. Even if we did manage to set the value of the local variable called myvar in the scriptable task, nothing outside of this scriptable task will know that we did that. So we need an outward binding. Well, you're probably thinking to yourself, no problem. All I have to do is create an output parameter. We'll call it myvar since it's the same variable. And as long as we create that output parameter with an outward binding to E1, then everything will be good. But that won't work. You can't do that outward binding because you can't even create an output parameter called myvar. You cannot, in general, have workflow variables such as an input parameter and an output parameter with the same name. I cannot have an input parameter called myvar and an output parameter called myvar. VRO does not allow that. Same thing's true with attributes. Whether I have an input parameter, output parameter, or an attribute called something, none of the other types can have a variable with that same name. So only an input parameter, output parameter, or an attribute can be called myvar. So we can't achieve what we're trying to do here, and this is why attempting to change the value of an input parameter is destined to fail. So now that we understand what the problem is, let's continue onwards a bit. and take a look at what we're going to need to do instead. Now, the first thing we're going to do is add a new schema element that's going to be at the very beginning of our workflow. And we're going to take the code that was formerly in that first schema element and we're going to move it later on in our workflow. So whereas in the previous slide we saw that E1 was doing the code that we see here on the screen, now we're going to have E1 do something different. We're going to have E1 copy the value of the input parameter to an attribute. Now notice, if you will, we've changed the name of our input parameter. It's just essentially the same name as before, but we've prepended the letters in onto the beginning of the variable to make it clear this is an input parameter. Additionally, we're going to still have a variable in our workflow called myvar, but it's not going to be an input parameter. Rather, this time it's going to be an attribute. So by virtue of having an inward binding, as we see illustrated with the red arrow, from in myvar to some variable inside of E1, that'll allow us to see in E1 what the current value is of in myvar. Now, since we want to copy the value that's in the input parameter to the attribute, that means we're going to be writing a value out to the myvar attribute, which means we're going to need an outward binding. But effectively, if we can set something up like this, we'll be able to do what we were trying to do originally. We won't actually be changing the input parameter, but we will have a variable in our workflow called myvar that we'll be able to pass between different schema elements, and we'll be able to see initially in the attribute called myvar, we'll see initially it has the value of the input parameter, but we'll be able to make changes to the attribute later on our workflow. So again, anywhere else in the workflow that we want to, we can do an inward binding to the attribute called myvar so that we can see what is currently stored in that variable. And with an outward binding, we'll be able to change at any time we want the value of the myvar attribute. Now there's actually at least two different techniques that you can use to achieve the effect we're trying to achieve. Now the first technique I'm going to show you works, but for reasons you'll see later on in this video, this is not my preferred technique. But let's take a look at this first technique. To demonstrate this first technique, let's start by creating a new workflow. I'll call this new workflow first technique. Now in actual practice, I should go over to the General tab and I should type a description and do the usual things I should do, but in the interest of speeding up this video, I'm going to jump ahead a bit here. In fact, I'm going to jump straight to let's go to the Inputs tab, and as you'll recall, we need two variables here. One of those variables I'm going to call in myvar. That is going to be a number, so let me change its type. And again, I should type a description, but to save time, I'm going to skip that. So I've got an input parameter called in myvar, and it's a number type variable. I also need a attribute. Let me shrink this section here. There we go. And I will add a new attribute called myvar, which is also going to be a number. And I could type a value. In this case, I'm not going to need to, so I'll leave that blank. And I should type a description, but to save time, I'm not going to. So I have an attribute called myvar and an input parameter called in myvar. Now to use this first technique, what we're going to do is go to the schema, and we'll drag in a scriptable task. We'll go down to the pane in the bottom, and over here we'll go to the in tab, because we need to bring in the value of the input parameter into this scriptable task. So to do so, we've gone to the in tab. We'll click the bind to workflow parameter or attribute button. And when we do so, as you can see, with an inward binding, we can either bind to an input parameter, which is what this first variable is, or we could do an inward binding to an attribute, which the second variable is. An inward binding is possible to either of these variables. For our purposes, though, we're going to do a binding to myvar, the attribute. And we'll click Select. Now, notice what we've got here. We have a binding. On the End tab, we have an inward binding between two different variables. Now, these columns are not labeled this exactly, but I think of this first column as the local variable column. There is a local variable now in the scriptable task, a local variable called myvar. For the second column, though it doesn't say this exactly, I think of this as saying workflow variable. This here is a workflow variable. It currently happens to be an attribute, although it could have been an input parameter. But my local variable, called myvar, is connected to a workflow variable that happens to have the exact same name, and which is an attribute. So far so good, except the problem here is the local variable myvar does not contain the value of the input parameter. So what we can do here is create an inward binding. With a little trickery here, we can create an inward binding between our local variable and our workflow variable that holds the value of the input parameter, which, as you'll recall, our input parameter is the one called INMyVar. So instead of linking our local variable to the workflow attribute, we're going to click here and change this. So the source parameter, the workflow variable, is currently the attribute, but we're going to click here and change that to bind to the input parameter instead. So we'll select the input parameter and click Select. Now at this point, within this scriptable task, the local variable called myvar actually currently contains the value of whatever the user passed into INMyVar, the input parameter. So in effect, we've already achieved the necessary task of copying the input parameter's value into a variable. But right now that variable is local to our scriptable task, and only in the scriptable task will we see that variable. Okay, so we're partway there with this technique, but there's one other thing that we need to do. We're going to need to set up an outward binding. Let's go to the Out tab. And again, we'll click the binding button here. And in this case, we're going to only have the choice of myvar. Since we're doing an outward binding, the input parameter doesn't show up in this list now. For an outward binding, we can only bind to an output parameter. We don't have any of those. Or to an attribute, which is what myvar is. So I'm going to bind to the one and only thing I've got, which is this variable called myvar. So at this point, our workflow schema element, the scriptable task, has a variable called myvar that contains the value of the original input parameter, but because we also have an outward binding, we're able to actually make a change to that variable called myvar, and then have that variable's value show up in other parts of our workflow. But there's one more thing you have to do. Now, some people, when they use this technique, say that no coding is required, but in actual practice, you do need to type some code. You'll notice if I click Validate, I get a warning message here, and if it's not an outright error, it's just a warning, but if I want to make that warning message go away, I've got to add some code. So I'll go to the scripting tab. I'm going to type some code, but as you can see, I just type // all this is a comment. So I'll say no code required, which strictly speaking isn't true. I mean, even though that's a comment, that's actual code. So strictly speaking, you do have to have some code here to make that warning message go away. So now that we've got this, in any other scriptable tasks or other schema elements in our workflow from here on out, if we do an inward binding to the attribute called myvar, we'll be able to see what's in that variable, and we'll also be able to do an outward binding to the attribute called myvar, thereby enabling us to change the value of the attribute anywhere we want from here on out in our workflow. But what we've done in effect with this first scriptable task is we did the copying. So why don't we actually change the name of the scriptable task to something a little more descriptive, like copy input parameter, or maybe it's parameters, to attributes. So that's what the scriptable task does, and from here on out in our workflow, we will be able to make use of that attribute. We can see the original value of the input parameter. We can change the value, not of the input parameter, but of our attribute. So again, this was the first of two techniques I'm going to show you. For me personally, this is not my preferred technique because it tends to rely on trickery is perhaps too strong of a word for it, but the way we set it up in this particular case is depending upon some side effects that aren't immediately obvious. There's a side effect going on here that gets the variable copied over, and that's not immediately, if you're paying real close attention to the bindings in a workflow, if I'm reading someone else's workflow and I look really closely at these two columns, I can deduce that some copying is going on, but it's not obvious. So again, this is the first technique. It works, but it's not my preferred technique. As I mentioned earlier, there's actually multiple techniques that you can use. Here comes the second technique, and as you can see, this is my preferred technique. And after I show you how it works, I'll show you why it's my preferred technique. Now that we know the first technique, let's take a look at the second technique. Again, I'm going to create a new workflow. So I'll say new workflow. I'll call this one second technique. And as in the previous example, I'm going to shortcut some things here. I'm not going to bother to type a description for the workflow, but I should. And I'm not going to type descriptions for my variables, though I should. But again, I'm going to try to do this more quickly. So once again, I'm going to create an input parameter called INMyVar. Once again, that one's going to be a number. And I'm going to create an attribute. Let me collapse this here. I'm going to create an attribute called myvar, and it too will be a number. So far, so good. So I have an attribute called myvar and an input parameter called INMyVar. Now to use the second technique, I'm going to go to this schema tab, and once again I'm going to drag out a scriptable task, and I may as well tell you what I'm going to be doing here. I'm going to make this scriptable task copy the input parameter to the attribute. Now to do so, I could use the in-out tab technique for creating the bindings that I need, or if you're familiar with this setup wizard, I could use that. In this case, though, I'm going to use a third way of doing binding, which is visual binding. So I'll go straight to the visual binding tab, and as we can see down below, let me resize things a bit here. The visual binding tab has several different sections. This section over here on the left side and this section over on the right side are telling me about my workflow variables. So in my workflow, I have an input parameter called INMyVar. I do not have any output parameters. I do have an attribute called myvar, and since it's an attribute, I can do an inward binding to the myvar attribute. But since it's an attribute, not only can I do an inward binding, over here we can see that if I wanted to, I could also do an outward binding to the attribute called myvar. So again, when you see the outer columns, remember those are workflow variables. On the other hand, this section in the middle is talking about the variables inside of the schema element that we have selected. So up above, I have selected the schema element called copy input parameter to attribute, and sure enough, down on the bottom, it tells us this section here is talking about the variables within the local variables within copy input parameter to attribute. Now, in this particular case here, if I want to copy what's in the input parameter, I need to create an inward binding to that variable. And to do so with the visual binding tab is really straightforward. I'm just going to click on this triangle corresponding to the input parameter. I'm holding down the button. I'm going to drag to the middle section and let go. And as you can see, what I now have is an inward binding. All the binding lines that you see over here are inward bindings. Any bindings you see over here are outward bindings. But my inward binding is between my input parameter called INMyVar and my local variable inside of the scriptable task that happens to have the exact same name. So in one sense, that's kind of convenient. I'll know exactly what I'm working with when I'm working with this local variable called INMyVar. I'll be seeing what's in the input parameter called INMyVar. Now for this technique to work, I'm also going to need to change the value of the myvar attribute, but I'm not going to create an inward binding because inward bindings don't let me change the value of an attribute, but rather an outward binding lets me do that. So I'll click, drag, and drop over here. So now within my schema element, I have a variable. They're both local variables, but I have a variable called INMyVar. It has an inward binding to the input parameter called INMyVar. That means I can see what's in that input parameter just by reading this local variable. And similarly, I have a local variable called myvar that is outwardly bound to the attribute called myvar. If I change the value of the myvar local variable, then the myvar attribute's value will also change. So right off the bat, I like this technique because it makes it really clear what binding's going on. And then in terms of the coding, yes, it does require some coding, but it's really straightforward. The code is simply going to be myvar equals, because I want to change the value of that variable. That's the attribute. I want to change its variable, and I want to change it to whatever's currently in the input parameter called INMyVar. And if you don't like doing all that typing, you don't have to type anything at all. Just insert your cursor here and click myvar. Well, you do have to type the equal sign. myvar, I got by clicking myvar, equals INMyVar, semicolon, and boom, I'm done. That's all it takes. From here on out, if I want to, I can add additional schema elements and create an inward binding to the myvar attribute to see what's in there. Initially, I'll see the same value that the input parameter is set to, but because myvar is an attribute, I could also do outward bindings, thereby enabling me to make changes to the variable. So again, for me, this is the preferred technique to use out of these two techniques I've shown you because it's more explicit and more obvious what it's doing. I can see in a glance that I can see the flow of data. It looks like I've got data coming in from this input parameter, comes into my scriptable task, and it looks like it's going to go out to this attribute. And additionally, the code is very straightforward. Attribute name equals input parameter with a semicolon on the end of it. It's very straightforward code. The code's easy for me to write, but it's also easy for my coworkers who are going to be looking at my code, or even if I'm looking at my workflow 6 months from now, it's going to be more obvious to me what this workflow is doing. But regardless whether you use the first technique or this second technique, which is the one I prefer, they both work. So they're both valid ways of doing things. But in either case, what we have here in effect is a design pattern that you're going to see very, very often. The design pattern in effect is, as the first schema element in your workflow, add a scriptable task, and using either of these techniques, copy in one or more input parameters, not all of your input parameters, but copy in the input parameters that you expect to be changing in the workflow, and copy those input parameters to attributes. That is the design pattern that you'll see time and time again. And similarly, the same sort of issue exists for output parameters. Output parameters are write-only variables, which means you can change the value of an output parameter within your workflow, but you'll never be able to see what's in your output parameters. So as a design pattern, at the end of your workflow, you will put a scriptable task that copies any attributes whose values you want to save to output parameters. So again, this is just a run through of a couple different techniques. It's up to you to decide which technique you want to use. You know my preference, but you're the programmer, you're the one writing the workflow, you get to decide how you're going to write your workflow. I would be curious to hear from anyone who has any opinions on which technique you prefer. In particular, I would love to hear from people who prefer the first technique over the second technique. I've shown you how to do these two techniques. I've shown pretty clear what my preference is, but I would love to hear from you to find out what you think and what you find works best in your workflows. So take a few moments if you would, and let me know what you think down in the comments below. Thank you very much, and see you in the next video.